Hey City Church, in light of the news about George Floyd and the protests the past few weeks, our church hosted a conversation where three brave church members from black backgrounds shared about racism that they've encountered, and their stories of abuse, of suffering and of unnecessary shame were gut-wrenching and hard to hear, and I know it impacted many of us deeply. And it's with this in mind I wanted us to look at Hebrews 12 verses 23 to 24 today, hoping that they might be helpful and healing at this time. Let me read Hebrews 12, 23 to 24. It says, "You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." If you think about bloodshed, you think about fights, about war, about hatred, about racism, you think of horrible, dark things, type of stuff that you don't want to spend much time dwelling on. But as Christians, we should think about it, and we shouldn't be surprised at how dark it can get, because as disgusting as racism is, its root is sin, a toxic thing that infuses all of us. In fact, we as Christians believe that the root problem here in what's been going on is not white privilege, is not greed, is not slavery, is not Jim Crow, and it's not the dehumanization of an entire race as though they're property, as disgusting as that is. The root is sin. And we need to have a good understanding of the doctrine of sin, because that helps us understand what's going on in the world right now. If we have all fallen short of the glory of God, if we have all sinned, if we all hate God and have hatred in our hearts, it makes us capable of as horrific acts as those we see in the news. Don't believe me? Let me show you that from the Bible. In literally the first few pages of the Bible, sin has entered the world. Adam and Eve have their first two children, two little brothers, Cain and Abel. But in this world where sin has entered, these boys grow up, and within a few sentences, Cain is full of so much envy and hatred, and sin grasps him so strongly, he kills his brother. And this cycle of envy, hatred, jealousy, oppression, it continues to this very day. Sin infects all of us. We are all prone to it. In fact, the Bible tells us we are slaves to sin. Now, just because all of us have the same root in us, it doesn't mean that we should accept it. We should be disgusted by sin. We should be disgusted by racism. We should cry out for justice. In fact, the Bible tells us that in the situation here where Abel, Cain's brother, the victim, is killed, his blood cries out for vengeance, for justice. And that's where the passage in Hebrews 12 comes in. Let me read it again. It says, "You have come to God, the judge of all, to the spirits of the righteous made perfect, to Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, and to the sprinkled blood that speaks a better word than the blood of Abel." Humanity cries out for justice. Abel's blood cries out for vengeance, for someone to pay. And Jesus gets off his throne, comes onto earth, and dies on the cross for us. He pays, and his blood is spilled for enemies who hate him. His blood is spilled for reconciliation, for healing, and for forgiveness. And then he calls us Christians to follow him and to love our enemies. Now, I know that's where it gets tough, right? Because the idea of loving those who hate you and who do things that are dark and who are horrific in their behaviour, that's just difficult. But then I think back to the stories that were shared by those three brave people in our church, one of them being a godly saint who's well into her 70s and has chosen time and time again to love and to forgive, as she has faced racial abuse, as her husband has faced racial abuse, and as her children have done so too. She has loved, she has forgiven, and she has been kind. Let me just say one thing. It's really easy to hate, and it will take no effort at all for us to grow up to be grumpy old men and women. But if you want to be somebody who is joyful, who loves, you've got to understand what Jesus has done. You've got to understand how his blood speaks a better word, and you've got to work at trying to forgive. It's tough, I understand, but it's worth it. Jesus has modeled something better. And what's the other option? To continue hating? It's hatred that causes something as dark as racism. It's hatred that allows Cain to kill his very own brother. And the hatred that exists in you will cause you to do the very same thing, to follow that very same path. But Jesus has modeled something greater. He's given us a better way. He's given us a better word. And the only way that we will be free from bitterness, envy, and from this cycle of hatred is to see Jesus, to see our sin and be disgusted by it, but then to be ridiculously encouraged at how wonderful, merciful, and kind God is to forgive us all. His blood speaks a better word, and to the extent that you believe that, you'll be able to forgive, love, and heal as we move forward.